So far, we have spent 2024 making our way through the first part of the book of Genesis. Genesis, if you were open up a Bible, Genesis is the first book in the Bible, and Genesis literally means origins. That's what the word means. And it's a book about origins. And the first part of Genesis, specifically the first 11 chapters, is really kind of what we call like universal history, universal origins. It's about really all of us. From Genesis 12 on, it's going to focus in on one group of people, but the first 11 is kind of like, how did we get here? And why is the world the way that it is? And so we've been making our way through that, and we're going to kind of wrap that up today. And so Genesis begins in this really one of the most famous stories in all of Scripture. It's a story of creation, that God creates. He speaks the world into existence. And when God creates the world, he creates this flourishing, thriving world, and he gives it to human beings who are his image bearers, the one part of creation made in his image. And God says, I'm going to rule creation through humanity. And so we've shared this kind of diagram. This is a diagram we created. It's not like in the Bible or anything like that, but this we created. This just kind of shows, hey, here's what leads to a flourishing, thriving creation. That you have God, you have humanity, you have the rest of physical creation, and when those things live in right relationship with one another, then creation thrives. And humans thrive, and creation thrives, and all of that. But what the story of Genesis goes on to tell us is that this is the world God creates, this is the world God gives to humanity, but then, from this point on, creation really begins to unravel. And from Genesis 3 on, this thriving, flourishing creation kind of starts to come apart. When we talk about the early part of Genesis, a lot of times people refer to this one event they call the fall. And it's the whole Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden story, and they'll say the fall, that's where everything went wrong. But what's interesting is when you look at the first part of Genesis, they talk about the story of Adam and Eve, and that may be the first mistake when things started to go wrong. But the first part of Genesis actually tells this story where, like, in event after event, in choice after choice, like creation just kind of continues to unravel. That it may start in the Garden of Eden, but it just kind of gets worse and worse and worse. And so here's kind of the events, here's kind of this roadmap that we've looked at as we've made our way. As you have creation, then you get into the Garden of Eden. Then after Eden, Adam and Eve had these kids, Cain and Abel. One of them kills the other. Human beings turn on each other. We start to kill one another. Then you get to Noah and the flood, and things get really bad. And it's not one person killing another people. It's a whole bunch of people killing a whole bunch of other people. And then you get to the Tower of Babel, where everybody tries to come together, but it's rooted in pride and fear and arrogance. And the result is division and growing injustice. And so what happens, interestingly, in the first part of Genesis is if you go back to the creation story, the way that the creation story is written is out of chaos, God creates order. And then he gives it to human beings. And Genesis 11 then kind of wraps up with this out of order, we as human beings have created chaos. And so what happens now? This is the world. This is what we've done with it. And what happens now? Now that we've taken this ordered, structured, flourishing, thriving world and we've created chaos, where do we go from here? Now, before we wrap this up, there's a couple things that I want to just mention out of the first few chapters of Genesis, just because when people read Genesis, if you've read it, these are often questions that people have, like, what is this all about? And you could spend a lot of time talking about these. I just want to mention them because I think they're worth mentioning. The first one is, when you read through Genesis 1 through 11, you will find these genealogies of people that claims they lived for like a long time. Like, I'm not talking like 100 years, I'm talking like 800-900 years. Like, this person lived, and you're just going like, oh my gosh. What is that even all about? Then when you get to the flood story, there's actually this one particular sentence where it says that, and God limited their lives to 120 years. So you look at these genealogies, you look at how long it claims that people lived, and you're like, what is this all about? A lot of people will use that to say, like, well, this is proof that Genesis can't be right. And here's the thing, I just want to say, you have different scholars that will argue differently about why it says that. But here's one thing I want to point out that's just interesting to me. Summer, not the season, but the nation. There's a nation, it's a lot of times referred to as a cradle of civilization. You might not have heard the name Sumer before, but you've probably heard Sumerian. You talk about Sumerian gods, Sumerian goddesses, Sumerian culture. I think it's actually one of the cultures they mentioned in the original Ghostbusters when they're talking about where these gods come from, is you have like Sumerian gods and goddesses. So Sumer is this ancient civilization. It's one of the cradles of civilization. We have this Sumerian kings list. So it's a list of people, kings who ruled in Sumeria, or some are from, it's like the second, third millennium BCE. So it's old, it's ancient. When you look through this list, especially the early part of the list, this list claims that there were kings who were Sumerian kings who ruled for like thousands of years. Like it wasn't just, hey, these people ruled for thousands of years. And so here's really about all we can say is whatever it is that Genesis is claiming about how these people lived and the length of time these people lived, it's not strictly like a Genesis phenomenon. So whatever's happening, some people say that, like, no, it says in there that God literally limited their years, or that God limited their years. I've heard people argue that actually the flood, when there is a flood, that it actually changes the dynamics of the world and changes the dynamics of the environment, and that limits it. Some people actually argue that claiming that people lived a long time or ruled a long time was just a way to pay them honor. Like, this was such a great person. It seemed like they ruled for 1,000 years. Whatever is happening, it's not strictly a like Genesis phenomenon. It exists in others. So whatever the reality is, you can't look at it and go, oh, well, see, this is proof that Scripture is wrong, because it exists in these other places. The other thing I want to mention real quick is when God creates everything, in Genesis 1, he creates the heavens and the earth. And he creates everything that lives and exists in both of those places, in both of those spheres. And so when Genesis begins to tell its story kind of unraveling creation, the focus is on what's happening on earth. But it's also clear that kind of the unraveling of God's creation also impacts the heavens, right? Because when you get to Genesis 3, the Adam and Eve story in the Garden of Eden, you have this serpent who later becomes identified as Satan, although Genesis doesn't specifically say that. And it's kind of clear that this serpent it's not a normal like animal because it talks. None of the other animals talk. And it's kind of this metaphor for this evil that's we might call demonic or spirit or whatever you want to call it. But it's a part of creation because it's listed as a part, but it's not human and it's not just like any other animal. And then when you get into Genesis 6, there's these references to the sons of God and the Nephilim, which people, again, you have scholars and people who will say, well, this is what this is what that is, and no one really knows for sure exactly what that means. But what's clear is that kind of the unraveling of creation, the rebellion, the fall, whatever you want to call it, it impacts both heaven and earth. That there are beings that God creates that are not human beings, they're, again, whatever you want to call them, angels or whatever, that are also a part of this rebellion and this fall. Now, this, though, is really, really important. That the Genesis story and the rest of the biblical story is going to focus on the earth because the earth and physical creation that way is the one part of creation that is now threatened. See, God in the heavens, whenever there's rebellion or whatever happens in the heavens, God is never threatened. His reign, his rule in heaven is never threatened. Okay, heaven is God's domain. It's where God lives. And so these other beings, these other creatures, whatever they are never a threat to God. They never directly attack God because Genesis makes clear nobody can stand up to God. Nobody can. So, okay, there's these beings, Satan, whatever you want to call them, that rebel, but God is never, his reign in heaven is never threatened. Ever. These spiritual beings or whatever, like they end up falling, something happens, and again, Genesis isn't really clear, which is why we're not talking about it. It kind of gets unraveled in some other places. There's references, no one really knows for sure, but God always reigns. His authority, his reign in heaven is never threatened, which is why when Jesus shows up, Jesus' prayer is, God, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. His reign in heaven is never, ever directly threatened. He's never directly opposed. These beings have to become shrewd. They have to become wise, which is what the serpent is referred to as, because they're never going to take him head on. The issue is on earth. And it's because of the way God has chosen to rule earth. God chose to rule earth through human beings, through his image bearers. And so because his image bearers have become distorted and fractured, his reign on earth is challenged because of that. So that's now where Genesis, again, is going to focus, is what happens now. What happens in this physical creation now that the way God has chosen to rule through his people has become fractured and has become distorted. And we've said all along that throughout the early part of Genesis, God is always holding these two things in tension. On one hand, he's holding humanity in tension, his image bearers. And no matter what we do, he refuses to give up. He will not just abandon. He will not just walk away. But on the other hand, he's not willing to give up on his creation and the flourishing, thriving intent that he had when he made it. So he's not just willing to sit back and say, oh, well, my image bearer screwed up. You guys are done. He's also not just willing to say, well, I gave it the old college try and it didn't work out, so I might as well just let the whole thing burn to the ground. He's holding these two things in tension and saying, okay, what do we do now? And this is the question that, like from Genesis 12 on, that Genesis 12 on is going to address, is Genesis 1 to 11, again, is the kind of backstory. How did we get here? And the story that Genesis 1 through 11 leaves us with is we find ourselves living in a world. It is a world of human achievement. It is a world of human technology. People are building, right? Culture's advancing. But it is a human world that is rooted in pride and fear that has led to division and growing injustice. That's the picture that Genesis 1 through 11 paints. That's the world that you and I know now. This world of advancement and achievement apart from God. It's a world of human achievement rooted in fear and pride that's divided, and there's a growing sense of injustice. So what is God going to do now? Now that this backstory has kind of been said, what does God do in the world that you and I now find ourselves in? So Genesis 11 closes by introducing us to this guy by the name of Terah. And Terah is from the city of Ur, which is in kind of like southern Iraq, so modern-day Iraq. And what we know about Terah, and we learn this actually later on in another book in the Old Testament called Joshua, is that Terah is an idol worshiper, so he is not a follower of the one true God, the creator God of Genesis. He is an idol. In fact, there's Jewish traditions that actually argue that he's an idol maker, that this is how he earns his living. He is this kind of evil idol worshiper, possibly idol maker. And it makes sense because where he lives in Ur is the center, one of the centers of a cult that used to worship the moon god. And so Terah and his family, very comfortable in what we might call paganism, worshiping this moon god, idols. Terah, for whatever reason, decides that he wants to pack up his family and move to Canaan. Now, Canaan is what you and I know as Israel and the Palestinian territories. So Terah packs up his whole family, because back in the day, that's what you did. You didn't just take yourself. You took kids, grandkids, servants, anybody that you may have. They pack up, they leave. Now, they never make it to Canaan. They end up traveling 550 miles to northern Iraq, and they settle down in Haran, which actually makes complete sense because Haran, much like Ur, is another center of the god of the moon cult. And so if Terah is an idol maker, he can settle down, he can get right to work, he can open up shop, he's comfortable in that culture, comfortable in the values, the tradition, the faith, the temples, all of that. This is where they settle down. Now, two of the people that are with Terah when he makes this move are his son Abram and then Abram's wife Sarah. Now, it's pretty safe to assume, based on what we know about ancient cultures, that Abram and Sarah also worship the same gods and idols that Terah does. Now, I will say, there are some people, particularly within the Jewish tradition, because Abram becomes like the patriarch of Judaism, that say that Abram would never, ever have worshipped idols. And that there's nothing that says that Abram did, but again, what we know historically about the way families worked and about the way temples and religions worked, I just think he did. That's how you had family gods, you had local gods, that's what happened. And so Abram and Sarah most likely worship the same moon god. One thing we do know for certain about Abram and Sarah is at the time that they pack up and they move and they go with Terah, they are barren. They're unable to have children, which is a painful thing if you've ever experienced that. If you've ever battled through infertility, you have infertility, it is a difficult thing. It's a really difficult thing. Now, we have a lot of advances in medicine that can kind of help us, like, hey, maybe you can conceive, or at least we have ways medically, a lot of times, not all the time, but we have ways of medically understanding this is why you're not able to conceive. They didn't have that advancement in the ancient world. And so when you couldn't have children, specifically as a woman, there was kind of this negative connotation that was put on you that something was wrong with you. And I don't mean just medically. Again, they didn't have the medical advancements, but there was something wrong with you. You were incomplete. Maybe you had some bad issues or flaw or whatever it was. So it was bad enough that you couldn't have children and you felt like a failure, but then there was this public shame that was put on you that there's obviously clearly something that is wrong with you. And so Terah ends up dying in Haran, and then you have Abram and Sarah, this old barren couple. They find themselves far from home, far from what's comfortable, far from what's familiar, And then Genesis 12, 1 through 3 says this. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all people on earth will be blessed through you. So God, the creator God, the God who spoke the cosmos into existence, he now shows up to Abram and Sarah 550 miles from home. Abram's father has just died, and what he tells them is, go. It's the first thing he tells them. Not, hello, my name is, nice to meet you. He just says, go, which is in stark contrast to what humanity has been up to. Remember the story that happened, the story we looked at last week, if you were here last week, if you watched last week, the story we looked at last week was about people not wanting to go. It was about people wanting to stay and build this tower and build this civilization that was a monument to human achievement. See, as humanity, as people, we are always trying to centralize. It's always what we do. Let's centralize. Let's bring everything together. God's command to his image bearer since the beginning is go. He says multiple times in the first part of Genesis, fill and subdue the earth. Go, go, go. But people over and over again, no, we stop. We want to centralize. God is always saying, no, decentralize. Go out. That's why I created you. So the first thing he says to Abram is in direct contrast of what is natural to us. Don't centralize, decentralize. I want you to go. And then Abram is promised that you will have all these descendants. You will become a great nation. I will give you this piece of land. That's the promise that's made to Abram. And again, Abram is not like 30 years old in his prime, 27. I mean, he's older at this point. Even the fact that he could have kids kind of seems like ridiculous at this point, but this is God's promise, is you will have offspring, you will have descendants, you will become this great nation, and I will give you this piece of land. And your people will thrive. And the goal of all of that, the purpose of all of that, the reason God is going to bless Abram with a family, with a nation, and with a piece of land has nothing to do with Abram and his family. It is for the benefit of the nations. God says, I'm going to do this for you so that all people on earth will be blessed through you. And the land that God is ultimately going to give to Abram and his descendants is the land of Canaan. Again, what you and I know as Israel and the Palestinian territories. And so when you look at a map of kind of the ancient Mediterranean world, the kind of like red oval, that's the piece of land God gives them. He's going to plant them literally right in the middle of the cradle of civilization. He doesn't place them in like a fortress area. He puts them in the thoroughfare of the ancient world. This is this place where the world collides. If God wanted to give them a place that was like defensible, that they could be protected from, he would not have given them that piece of land. This is the center of where everything comes together. Because if you think about like all throughout history, you have the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Egyptians, the Romans, like this is where all that stuff collides. So what God does is rather than pick one of the existing nations, right, and saying which one has their act most together, you win. We're going to pick you. God comes to, and get this, he comes to an older, immigrant, idol-worshiping, barren couple. Literally the least likely candidates at all. And he tells them, I want you to go. And here's what I'm going to do for you. You're going to be blessed with these descendants. You are going to be blessed with this land. And the goal of it is ultimately to bless the nations. I'm going to put you in the middle of everything so that you have this incredible opportunity to bless everyone. Now, from this point on, from Genesis 12 on, the rest of the biblical story, all throughout the Old Testament and then into the New Testament, on to Revelation, is going to focus on the descendants of Abraham. That's what he'll become. Abram, his name will get changed to Abraham. The descendants of Abraham and their purpose and mission in the world. Now, the Old Testament, which is the first part, makes up about 2/3 of the Bible. The Old Testament is going to specifically focus on his like biological descendants. that his kids, Abraham will have Isaac, Isaac will have Jacob, Jacob will have these 12 sons, they'll become the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is where Israel comes from. And so the Old Testament is going to focus on this story of Israel, really ultimately the rise and fall of Israel. How out of this immigrant, pagan, idol-worshiping, barren couple comes this nation. And how they kind of rise to prominence, but then ultimately how they fall. Now, the reason that Israel ends up falling or failing in the Old Testament story, it's really complicated. And there's a lot of different people, prophets, that will show up and that will accuse Israel of a lot of different things. Hey, you're doing this wrong. Hey, you're doing this wrong. But honestly, a lot of it centers around idolatry and politics. And it's crazy how often those two things collide, because what Israel's biggest problem is ultimately, who or what do you trust? Who or what do you trust to provide for you? Who or what do you trust to, and so they'll turn to other gods, they'll turn to other political entities, and God keeps saying, no, trust me, but they're trusting all of these other things. And so at the heart of Israel's failure is this trying to centralize and get control over their world and their reality and their situation. In the face of whatever's going on, there's times where there's famine, there's times where there's political unrest or war. What do we do? How do we maintain control? And their desire to centralize, one of the things they say is, give us a king, we want a king. And God says, I'm your king. And they say, well, you're not good enough, we want a real king. And in this really telling moment, God tells them like, hey, this is a really bad idea, but okay, go for it, good luck. Let me know how that works out for you. And they get a king, and they centralize, and they go for control, and the whole thing ends up falling apart. And Israel ends up getting conquered. But the way Israel gets conquered is pretty significant, because what happens is in 586 BC, Babylon marches into Jerusalem. They conquer Jerusalem, level the city, they burn the temple and the city to the ground, but they don't destroy all the people. They exile them. They force them to move out and live among the Babylonian Empire. So even in being conquered, what does God do with his people? He decentralizes them. Because again, the human temptation is let's centralize and let's control. And God says, nope, I want you to go. So then when you get into the New Testament, you have these people of Israel who, a lot of them have returned to their homeland. They're still scattered all over the Mediterranean world. Some have returned to their homeland. They've kind of rebuilt this temple. And out of really the remnant of Israel, out of the ashes of Israel, comes Jesus. And Jesus is Israel's Messiah. This is his claim. This is the claim of all the New Testament writers, that Jesus is Israel's Messiah. And everything God said he was going to do, he accomplishes in and through Jesus. That Jesus is the means by which God blesses all the nations through his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. And after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, his ascension, as he ascends into heaven, he tells everyone, I now, because of my death and resurrection, I have reclaimed all authority in heaven and on earth. And this is what the New Testament writers call the gospel. That the gospel is that Jesus is Lord. He's Lord over everything. He has conquered sin, he's conquered death, he's conquered evil, and he has ascended as the Lord over everything. And here's what then Jesus, out of the remnant of Israel, the first followers of Jesus, the Jesus movement that becomes known as the church, come out of the nation of Israel, out of the people of Israel, out of the ashes of Israel. He calls this remnant. And here's what he tells them to do. Matthew 28:19, he says, therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. Same thing he told Abram, go. I want you to go. You're going to be defined by how you go. And then the book of Acts, the book that tells about the growth and the expansion of the early church, Acts 1:8, Jesus says, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So out of the remnant of Israel, Jesus creates, and the New Testament will kind of use this language like the spiritual ancestors of Abraham. The New Testament will use this language that we have been grafted in. The Gentiles who are non-Jews are people who are grafted in to this people of God. And right from the very beginning, the church is created not as a national entity or a local entity, but as this decentralized movement that is sent into the world. And see, this is what I want us to see. This is super important. This is what Genesis 12, as it's wrapping up the early universal history of humanity, this is what Genesis 12 is getting at, and this is what you see in the rest of the biblical story. That God's response to the world in which we live is to form a missional people. That's what he does, right? You get to Genesis, and after the whole Tower of Babel story, you have this world, the world that you and I live in, that is this world of human achievement rooted in fear and pride and divided, and there's growing injustice. And what does God do? What is God's response? To form a missional people, to go into the world and to be his people. See, I said it in the beginning that all throughout the unwinding of the early part of Hey, there we go. Give it up. He fixed it. All right. So, where were we? Oh, yes. So God holds these two things in tension, right? That he won't let humanity go, no matter how far things, no matter how many mistakes we make. He won't, out of his love, he won't let humanity go, but he also won't let creation go. He won't just let it just go to its own destruction. So he's holding these two things in tension. So what do you do? What do you do when you have placed human beings, your image bearers in this world, to rule the world? That's how you're going to rule it, is through them. And the world is what it is because this is what we've created, but you're also not going to abandon creation to wherever it go. His response is to create and form a missional people who will embody his work of reconciling the world. Now this is super important. Super, super important. This probably wasn't as clear to Abraham as it is to us because we live post-Jesus and post his death, burial, and resurrection, but this is super important. The work of saving the world, of reconciling the world, of bringing creation back to where it was, because that's the biblical story. We talked all through Revelation in the fall. You can go back and watch online if you want to, but the ultimate conclusion of Scripture is that God brings creation back to what he originally created it to be. He's reconciling it, he's redeeming it, he's saving it, he's restoring it. These are all words that the New Testament uses to describe this is what God's up to. That work is done by God through Jesus. It is Jesus' work, Jesus' death and resurrection and his ascension. He's the one who claims all authority on heaven and on earth. It's his work. So when it comes to restoring, redeeming, repenting, even you get into these words that we don't like, words like judging, overcoming, conquering, whatever, the work is Jesus. It's not ours. Okay, the work of saving creation, restoring creation, it is God's work. God is making all things new. Christian faith is based on God's active agency in the world through Jesus and through his Spirit. The role of God's missional people is to embody that work. What does it look like when Jesus really has all authority? What does it look like when Jesus is really king? Not Caesar or Satan or sin or anything else. What does it look like when God actually is above everything and we live in a way what does it look like when we live the way that we were created to live? See, the missional people of God, this is true of Israel, this is true of the church. The missional people of God were created and formed to embody what the world is supposed to look like. And so when you get to the New Testament in the church, and even when you get, again, to the book of Revelation, what Revelation is saying over and over again is, listen, the job of the church is to show the world where everything's going. That God is redeeming the world. God is restoring the world. One day he's going to get there. One day Jesus is going to come back. He's going to restore it all. And so when he does, everything's going to be made right. And that's where you get this language. There will be no more tears. There will be no more death, all these other things. But the job of the church now is to embody that future reality. That in the church, this is what it looks like. This is where it's all going. In 1991, I went with my family. It's the summer of 1991. I think it was July 1991. Went with my family to a convention that was in Denver, Colorado. And it was a convention, it was like a gathering of churches from kind of our movement. We're from this movement called the Restoration or Stone Campbell movement. And they don't really do it anymore, but they used to kind of have this gathering where if you wanted to, people and families would get together in different places. It was called the North American Christian Convention. And so we went to this convention in Denver. And at the time, I don't think I'd ever been to Denver before. But we go to Denver, and when you get to Denver, Denver was super excited. Like the city was super excited because literally days before we got there, Denver had been approved as the site of an expansion team for Major League Baseball, what would become the Colorado Rockies. And so if you know anything about expansion sport, it's like a years-long process, and you go through all this bidding. So they were super excited. The city was super excited. Not only had they just been approved, but they'd also recently announced and revealed the logo. This is the name of the team. This is the logo. And so when we were there is when all this Colorado Rockies merchandise started coming out. And so I remember walking up and down the street, and you would have these stores that were like, we have Rockies merchandise. And you have people going in, and hats were selling out, and shirts were selling out. You know, all these people that were excited and that were stoked. And it's, hey, we're the Rockies. And everywhere you looked, you had these Rockies fans. Here's what's the incredible thing. The Rockies would not draft their first player for another year. They had no team. They had no players. None. It was 1991. They would not draft their first, we were there in July 1991. They would not draft their first player until June of 1992. So there wasn't like a team. There wasn't like a, but everyone is excited and anticipating where they know this is going. There may not be a team. There may not be players. But we know where this whole thing is headed. And our excitement and our passion is rooted on where we know this is going. This is what we mean when we say the church embodies where all of creation is going. That we live in such a way, we live with this love and joy and peace and compassion and service that's rooted in, hey, we know where it's going. Because Jesus came and Jesus conquered death, and he died and he resurrected and he ascended, and he has authority over everything, and he's actually in charge, and he's leading it, and he's already announced to us this is where it's going. So even though it's not there yet, we live in the joy and excitement and passion of love of where we know it's all going. Now, if you've been around here before, you've heard me mention Lesslie Newbigin. Lesslie Newbigin, like theologically, is one of my heroes. Lesslie Newbigin was a British guy who was a missionary to India from 1936 to 1974. Now, I don't know how much you know about history, but I just want you to imagine in your mind how much the world would have changed between 1936 and 1974. So Newbigin, as a British guy, goes to India and lives that whole time in India, comes back in 1974, and when he comes back, the realization that he makes pretty quickly is, this is not the world that I left. The Western culture of 1974 is not the same culture. And so Newbigin spends the latter part of his life like writing about Western culture and Christianity specifically, and Christianity's impact and influence in Western culture. And the heart of it is that he believes that Western culture needs to have a missionary encounter with Christian faith. Because Western culture, as much as it's rooted in Christianity, the culture that he came back to, he was like, this is not Christian. I want to share with you a quote. It's kind of a longer quote, but it's a brilliant quote. This is from one of his books, one of his more famous books called The Gospel in a Pluralist Society. And Newbigin's kind of an academic, so he uses some kind of academic words, but just kind of hold on, because what he says is really, really powerful. Here's what he writes. He says, I have come to feel that the primary reality of which we have to take in account in seeking for a Christian impact on public life is the Christian congregation. How is it possible that the gospel should be credible, that people should come to believe that the power which has the last word in human affairs is represented by a man hanging on a cross? I am suggesting that the only answer, the only hermeneutic, and hermeneutic is a word that has to do with how you understand, how you interpret something, right? He says the only hermeneutic of the gospel is a congregation of men and women who believe it and live by it. I am, of course, not denying the importance of many activities by which we seek to challenge public life with the gospel. Evangelistic campaigns, distribution of Bibles and Christian literature, conferences, and even books such as this one. But I am saying that these are all secondary, and that they have the power to accomplish their purpose only as they are rooted in and lead back to a believing community. And so what Newbigin became to understand, and what Newbigin spent the latter part of his life arguing for, is he said, listen, the only way that people will ever really see the truth of the gospel and the power of what it is that Jesus is doing is through a local congregation. And Newbigin said all these other things, right? All these other things that we do, marketing and conferences and events, He's like, he called them literally. He said, these are secondary. They're not bad. They're not bad, but they're secondary. And he said the only reason they are even beneficial is the extent to which they tie back to a local congregation. Because the only way, now we may not like this, and this may make us uncomfortable, but it just is what it is, because I think New Begin was right, that the only way people really see the power of God, the love of Jesus, is through a local congregation of people who actually live it. See, I think in Western Christianity, particularly in America, we have come to rely on everything that New Begin says is secondary. On advertisements, on conferences, on books, on this is how we're going to do it, this is how we're going to do it, this is how we're going to do it. And so we focus on events and we focus on decisions. And New Begin's observation is like, hey, those things in and of themselves aren't bad. But that's not the way God set up the church. That wasn't God's plan for dealing with the world in which we live. And if you go back historically, the church was at its best. The church was at its most effective. The church did its best work when it focused on embodied living, not all of these secondary things. Right? A historian, Rodney Stark, he kind of makes this argument. He traces the growth of Christianity in the Roman Empire. And he says that it grew on average 3.4% between the years 50 and 350. And by the time you get to 350, it had grown from like 1/10 of the population to over 50% of the population of the Roman Empire. From literally over a period of 3,000 years, it grew from a few hundred people to over 30 million. And now during that time period, there were traveling like evangelists or church planners like Paul. I mean, Paul is really the one with the best example of in the book of Acts, that Paul goes to all these cities and he shares the gospel and Jesus with all of these people. But even when you look at Paul's ministry, Paul's goal was not events, and Paul's goal wasn't even to get a certain number of conversions. Paul's goal everywhere he went was to start a sustainable congregation. A gathering of people that could continue to meet together. And really, Paul would say, hey, when we've got a sustainable congregation here, then we can move on. Because then this city has the presence of Jesus, the presence among it. One of the names for the early church, before it was actually called the church, was called the Way. That's what people called it. You'll even see that reference in the book of Acts, because it was this way of life, this way of living that was counter to the Roman way of living. A way of life rooted in Jesus, and a way of life that invited people in. And Tertullian, who's one of the early church fathers, here's what Tertullian said. He said this in the 2nd century. He said, here's why people join the church. He said, look, at the church specifically, look how they love one another. For they themselves, now talking about the pagans, they hate one another. But how they, the church, are ready to die for one another. And the pagans, they would rather kill one another. See, Tertullian said the reason that people joined the church isn't because they had great marketing campaigns or events or conferences or books. It's people looked at it and said, well, look, we're all just ripping each other apart. These people love each other. I want to live that way. So in this world of pleasure and power and excess and violence and exclusion, they fostered this community that was about sacrifice, generosity, service, and compassion. And that's what people were drawn to. And what's crazy about it is people joined this community knowing that they could be persecuted or maybe even martyred. And one of the things, I don't think we often realize this, one of the reasons that the church was so persecuted against in the early Roman Empire is the nature of the fact that they met in congregations. See, Roman religion, when you participated in Roman civic religion, you would go to the temple, you would offer a sacrifice, and then you would go home. That was it. It was just this ritual thing that you did. But when you belonged to the church, you were committed to other people, to this local congregations. And emperors hated groups of people. Here's why. There were 76 emperors that ruled between Augustus, the first emperor, and Constantine, who comes along in the 300s and converts the empire to Christianity. 76 emperors. Only 19 of them died of natural causes. So if you're an emperor, you're always worried about, hey, there's people that are meeting, they're trying to kill me, they're trying to overthrow me. One of the reasons that Christianity is so persecuted is because you have these people who gather together regularly, consistently, all the time. And you know what the central part of their gathering is? You know what their central confession is? Jesus is Lord, which is in contrast to the central Roman confession that Caesar is Lord. So you have these people who have this this conviction, this center to them that Jesus is Lord, and they gather together all the time, and they talk, and they share, and they do these things, and that is a threat. The congregational nature of the early church is one of the things that got them in such huge trouble. It is also the reason they were so incredibly successful. Harvard professor Alan Creeder says the early church was effective because they operated through this patient fermentation. Fermentation is the process by which you make alcohol. And the thing about fermentation is you kind of put everything together. You oftentimes put it in these barrels or these containers, and you just let it sit. And fermentation is this process that happens naturally. Here's just a picture of like kind of what fermentation looks like. It's just bubbles. And what happens in fermentation is you leave it there, and all the ingredients are there, and it just sits. And it looks like for a long time, nothing is happening. It's just there. And then all of a sudden, the bubbles start to rise. And you realize it's actually been changing the whole time. And before you know it, the whole thing is completely different. See, if you go back to Rodney Stark's work, this is what Rodney Stark is arguing about why the early church was effective. When you look at the Roman Empire and you see these people, you just like, the early church had no power, they had no authority, they had nothing. They're just there in these little gatherings of people, but it's almost like compounding interest. 3.4% this year, 3.4% that year. Like it grows and grows and grows, and you don't see it until all of a sudden you realize it's totally different. Everything's been changed. And the reason the early church was so effective is because this is the way they lived in these congregations, these gatherings of people, missional people who were embodying the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Now, there is an alternative to patient fermentation. There is an alternative way to go about trying to utterly turn a society completely inside out, and it's power. If you don't have the patience to wait for fermentation, you say, let's go get power. And if we have the power, then we can make the changes that we want. The problem is, power from the very beginning deforms people. The missional people of God were not created or formed to be powerful. Israel, part of the big reason that Israel got in trouble was its power. And part of what Jesus constantly called the church to do was to resist power. The church was not created to be powerful, but to be faithful. To be faithful to God. Now, you don't need me to tell you this because you know this. You know this because it's all over the news, or if you drive around town, you see all these signs. But it's an election year, which means it's just going to be awesome. We're going to celebrate the best of humanity, and it's going to be nothing but joy and peace and love, and you're just going to have great conversations with all your friends and family, and it's just going to be great. Woo! It's actually what we're going to see more than likely over the next 9 months or year, at least in our nation, is probably the worst of humanity. Right? Anger, division, hatred, all of that. And in the middle of that, as a church, we have a mission and an opportunity that has nothing to do with who or what we vote for or who or what wins. The opportunity that we have is in the midst of all of the division and the anger and the hatred and the name-calling, is to show people that the gospel actually works. And not just as a transaction that gets me into heaven, but as an entire way of life. It shows that, you know what, we can disagree and we can have differences and we can worship together and we can serve together. And we can get lunch and we can hang out and we can be friends despite our differences. Because of God and because of Jesus and because of what it is that he has done for us. That he himself is the means by which God is bringing everything together, including us as people. Remember what Newbegin said? Newbegin said the only hermeneutic of the gospel is the church. The only way people see Jesus as Lord over everything is they see it through the life of a local church and the way that we live with one another. How people understand. Again, we don't like this. We want to say, oh no, look to God, look to God. But New Begin's right. The only way people see the gospel is through us as a church. And so here's the point I want to make, that if we as a church community, if we are the hermeneutic of the gospel, we are the way that people see the gospel, then our hermeneutic, the way we have to see the world, is through the cross. That Jesus becomes our hermeneutic. How do we see the world? How do we view other people? Through the lens of Jesus on the cross, who gave himself to the benefit of everyone, emptied himself of everything out of his love, out of his compassion, to give himself to the world. And see, sometimes what we miss is that Jesus' death on the cross turns everything upside down. You know all those things we worry about, what's happening in the world? Listen to what Paul writes in Colossians. I love this verse. Paul's talking about what Jesus did on the cross. He's saying, having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over everything on the cross. But this is what Jesus does on the cross. All these things we worry about, all these things we freak out about, all these things that divide us, Paul literally says, don't you realize that on the cross, Jesus actually, he made a spectacle of those things. He showed that they're not really powerful, that he is. He overcame all of it. Jesus' death isn't about appeasing an angry God. Jesus' death is about restoring a broken creation and people and bringing everything back together under himself. It's one of the reasons that as a church every week we celebrate communion. And as you came in, hopefully you grabbed or were handed a thing of communion. If not, if you don't have one and if you want to celebrate communion with us, you don't have to do this, but if you want to, raise your hand. If you don't have one of these little things, and we have people that will come around that'll give you one. We got somebody down. Can you keep your hand up so we can? Yeah, there you go. Keep your hand up. We got one down in the front here. Take this one. I keep extras. Jesus, just before he was crucified, he told his followers. He said, "When you get together, I want you to do this. I want you to celebrate this to remember what it is I'm about to do for you." And so we celebrate communion to always remember what it is that God has done for us. That God in Jesus came to earth, died, rose again, and ascended. But we also take communion to remind us of who we are becoming in Jesus. Because Paul says the cross isn't just about Jesus, it's about us. That when we place our trust in Jesus, when we give our allegiance to Jesus, we share in his death and resurrection. And so the cross isn't just about Jesus, it's about us. And the cross then becomes the lens, the hermeneutic through which we see the rest of the world. It's how we engage with the rest of the world. It's how we view people. And so we take this as a celebration of what Jesus has done for us and who we are in him.